The girl sits at the edge of the hatch with her dog while snow piles 4 feet high against the cabin walls, and the temperature outside drops to 45 degrees below zero. Inside the chamber beneath her feet, where everyone said she had wasted an entire summer digging her own grave, the air holds steady at 54 degrees without a single log burning. Above ground, less than half a mile away, the men who laughed loudest are burning their furniture and still freezing to death in their proud log cabins. The wind screams across the Montana Territory with a fury that has not been seen in 50 years, carrying snow horizontally through the darkness, burying everything in its path. But here, in this small cabin on the edge of the wilderness, a 14-year-old orphan girl named Elsa Lindquist sits in perfect calm, her hand resting on the fur of her dog, her eyes watching the frost spread across the window glass like fingers reaching inward. She built what they mocked. She dug what they called a grave, and now, as the worst blizzard in memory tears across the settlement, she waits for the knocking that she knows will come. Before we continue with this story, let us know where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you find yourself moved by tales of frontier survival, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of those who proved the doubters wrong. The fire had gone out sometime after midnight on a February night, 8 months earlier. Elsa woke to the sensation of her own breath hanging visible in the darkness of the cabin, each exhale forming a small cloud of vapor that caught the faint moonlight before dissolving into the frozen air. She was 14 years old, and in the 3 seconds it took her to fully wake, she knew with absolute certainty that something was terribly wrong. The cold was not ordinary cold, not the manageable chill of a fire-burned low that could be fixed with a few logs and some patient coaxing. This cold was absolute and total, pressing against her face like a physical weight, sharp and merciless and patient in the way that only true winter cold can be patient. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the fire to fail, waiting for its opportunity to reclaim the small pocket of warmth that humans had carved out of its domain. Elsa reached for the extra bearskin that her father always kept folded at the foot of the bed, the one he added on the coldest nights when even a well-fed fire struggled to maintain comfort. Her fingers found the rough fur already pulled up over both of them, tucked carefully around her shoulders, arranged with the deliberate care that spoke of a father's love for his only child. Henrik Lindquist had woken in the night, felt the cold advancing, and covered his daughter more thoroughly before the frost could reach her. Elsa sat up in the narrow bed, her movements sluggish and difficult, her muscles stiff from the cold that had seeped into the cabin during the hours since the fire died. She reached across the narrow gap between their sleeping platforms and touched her father's shoulder through the pile of blankets and furs. The body beneath her hand was rigid and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. There is a particular stillness to death that cannot be mistaken for sleep, a complete absence of the subtle movements that accompany life. Henrik Lindquist possessed that stillness now. Elsa pulled her hand back slowly, not from horror, but from a kind of respect, a recognition that the gesture of reaching out was no longer appropriate. She did not call out or shake his shoulder or engage in the desperate denial that grief sometimes demands. She simply sat there in the darkness of the frozen cabin, her breath forming clouds that drifted toward the ceiling, understanding with terrible clarity what had happened and what it meant. Henrik Lindquist had survived 18 winters in the Montana Territory. He had trapped beaver along the Yellowstone and the Snake. He had survived encounters with grizzly bears and faced down hostile war parties. He had weathered blizzards that killed other trappers and crossed frozen rivers that had claimed dozens of lives. He had been competent, careful, methodical, and deeply respected among the settlers who worked these mountains. And he had died because a fire went out on a cold night, because the margin between life and death was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, because warmth was more fragile than all his experience had prepared him to accept. Elsa climbed down from her sleeping platform, her bare feet touching a floor so cold that it sent pain shooting up through her legs, and moved to the fireplace on the north wall of the cabin. The hearth was built of river stones carried one by one from the creek below and fitted together with clay mortar that her father had mixed and applied with the patience of a craftsman. Now the hearth held only ash, gray and lifeless, with no hint of the orange glow that meant living coals waiting to be revived. Elsa knelt on the frozen floor and reached into the cold fireplace, feeling through the ash for any ember that might have survived. Her fingers found nothing but cold powder. She had banked the fire herself before bed, exactly as her father had taught her. She had used the proper wood and arranged the fuel correctly. But fires were not machines. They were living things that sometimes simply died. And when fires died in the deep cold of a mountain winter, people died with them. Elsa buried her father 3 days later on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had worked together for 4 seasons. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of 20 inches, and digging through it was the hardest physical labor Elsa had ever performed. She worked with pickaxe and shovel, breaking the frozen earth inch by inch, her hands blistering inside her mittens, her shoulders and back screaming with pain that she ignored because the work had to be done. She wrapped her father's body in the best blankets they owned and placed his rifle and knife beside him, as was the custom. She covered the grave with stones to keep animals from digging and marked the site with a wooden cross made from split pine. Elsa Lindquist, born 1802, died February 1847, 45 years old. A good man who did everything right and still died because warmth was more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. Elsa stood at the grave for a long time after the work was finished, not praying exactly, but thinking about fire and cold and the thin margin that separated living from dying in the mountains. The wind cut through her coat as she stood there, stealing warmth from her body, reminding her that the same fate awaited her if she did not find a better way. When she returned to the cabin, she found it exactly as she had left it. Her father's traps hung on the wall, his tools lay on the workbench, his spare clothes hung from pegs driven between the logs, the physical evidence of a life, all of it now belonging to a 14-year-old girl who had never run a trap line alone or spent a winter without her father's guidance. Elsa sat at the small table and considered her options with the methodical thinking Henrik had taught her. She could leave and travel to Fort Union 3 weeks east, where she could sell her father's equipment and find work as a domestic servant. It was what most people would expect. A girl alone had almost no chance of surviving in the mountains. She could seek help from the scattered settler community. Magnus Eriksson lived 5 miles downstream and might take her in as a helper. The Bergman family lived 12 miles upriver and might provide shelter in exchange for labor. Old Tobias went, sometimes hired seasonal help, or she could stay. She could maintain her father's trapline, keep the cabin, and prove that she was capable of surviving what had killed a better person. She could refuse to let the cold win, refuse to abandon the life they had built together, refuse to accept that her father's death was the end of everything they had worked toward. The third option was probably foolish and certainly dangerous. It was reckless in ways she could not fully anticipate, challenging in ways she had never been tested. She was 14 years old with incomplete skills and knowledge that had gaps her father had intended to fill over coming years. But as Elsa sat in the cold cabin surrounded by her father's possessions, she realized the choice had already been made. She was not leaving, she was staying, and she was going to solve the problem that had taken her father's life. She was going to find a way to ensure that a failed fire would never kill anyone in this cabin again. She did not know yet how she would accomplish this. She did not have a plan or a design or even a clear concept of what the solution might look like. But she had time to think and learn, and she had her father's small collection of books, which contained more knowledge than she had ever explored while he was alive, to answer her questions directly. Elsa had been 9 years old when her family left Sweden, sailing from Gothenburg on a ship called the Margareta. The memories of that earlier life were fragmentary now, images without complete context, but some moments remained vivid. She remembered her father coming home from the ironworks, his clothes smelling of smoke and metal, his hands rough from the forge. She remembered her mother, Astrid, who had died of fever on the ship crossing the Atlantic, buried at sea somewhere between the old world and the new. But the memory that came to her now, sitting in the cabin 4 days after burying her father, was of the summer she had spent with her grandmother in the Swedish countryside. Her grandmother had lived in a house that was built partially into a hillside, with earth covering the roof and one entire wall backed by solid ground. Elsa remembered asking why the house was built that way, and her grandmother had explained simply, "The earth holds warmth in winter and coolness in summer. Build into the ground, and you need less fire to stay warm. Build above the ground, and you fight the weather every day." 9-year-old Elsa had not understood the significance. It was just an interesting fact, something to file away with other observations about how the world worked. But 14-year-old Elsa, sitting in a cabin where her father had frozen to death, understood it differently. Fire was unreliable. Fire required constant feeding, constant attention, constant fuel. Fire could go out despite every precaution. But the earth was different. The deep earth held a temperature that remained constant regardless of what happened on the surface. Grandmother's house had demonstrated this through the simple comfort of a home that never felt truly cold in winter. The earth did not need to be fed or maintained. It simply existed, holding its warmth year after year, available to anyone who understood how to use it. Elsa stood and walked to the corner where her father's books were kept. There were only 3 precious items Henrik had carried from Sweden: a Bible, a volume of Swedish folk tales, and a technical manual on mining and excavation that he had owned since his days working in the iron mines. Elsa pulled out the mining manual and opened it to the section on underground temperature. The manual confirmed what her grandmother had told her years ago, but with precision that transformed folk observation into engineering principle. At depths below 6 feet, Soil temperature remained relatively constant year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees depending on latitude. The surface might swing from 90 degrees in summer to 40 below in winter, but 6 feet down the variation was minimal. In the iron mines where Henrik had worked as a young man, the shafts maintained comfortable temperatures even in the coldest winters, requiring no heating beyond what the workers' bodies provided. Elsa read the chapter 3 times, absorbing the implications. Then she closed the book and looked around the cabin with new understanding. The cabin was built entirely above ground, exposed to every shift in weather. It fought against the environment with nothing but wood and mud and fire. But what if the cabin was not the answer? What if the solution lay below the cabin, in the earth that never froze? What if she could create a space beneath the floor where the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees? A refuge she could retreat to if the fire failed? The idea seemed impossible. She was 14 with no experience in excavation. The ground was frozen and would remain that way until spring. She had no one to help her, no one who would take such an idea seriously. But she had her father's mining manual, which contained detailed information about underground construction. She had 3 months before the ground thawed enough to dig, and she had nothing to lose except a life that the wilderness would probably take anyway, if she did not find something better. That night, Elsa made her decision. When spring came, she would dig a chamber beneath her cabin floor, a space 8 feet deep and 8 feet across, lined with stone, accessed through a hatch. A refuge where the earth would provide warmth without fuel, where cold could never reach her regardless of whether fire burned or died. The settlers would mock her. They would call her foolish and sad, but Elsa did not care what they thought. She cared about surviving, and she was going to build something that would let her survive regardless of what winter threw at her, regardless of all the things that could go wrong in a cabin that depended on flames for the thin margin between life and death. The snow began to retreat in late March, warmer days melting the drifts that had accumulated over 5 months of winter. Elsa had survived the remainder of winter through obsessive vigilance, waking 3 or 4 times each night to check the fire and add wood. She kept 4 days' worth of split firewood inside the cabin at all times, and never let the coals die completely. The routine was exhausting and unsustainable, proof that relying on fire alone was not a viable strategy. A single night of deep sleep, a single illness, a single accident that prevented her from tending flames, and she would die exactly as her father had died. While waiting for the earth to soften, Elsa traveled to neighboring homesteads to study how other settlers had built their root cellars and storage pits. She visited Magnus Eriksson first, asking permission to examine his cellar. Magnus granted permission with suspicious wariness, watching as Elsa descended into the 4-foot-deep pit and spent an hour measuring and taking notes. The temperature at the bottom was 47 degrees in early April, well below the surface temperature of 63. Magnus assumed the girl's interest was about food storage and offered advice about keeping vegetables from rotting. The Bergman family had a more substantial cellar, 6 feet deep and lined with flat stones. Elsa spent a full day helping Ingrid Bergman reorganize the storage space, earning the opportunity to study the construction in detail. The temperature at the bottom was 50 degrees, confirming what the mining manual had promised. She noted how the stones were fitted together, how drainage was handled, how the entrance was framed. Old Tobias Went had the most sophisticated cellar in the region, 8 feet deep, with a proper stone stairway and wooden shelving. The temperature at the bottom never varied from 52 degrees, regardless of surface conditions. Tobias had lined the walls with a double layer of stone, creating an air gap that provided additional insulation. Elsa asked detailed questions, and the old man answered with patience, pleased that someone appreciated his craftsmanship. She also studied natural formations. She found animal dens and examined how they were constructed, noting that animals dug into hillsides to take advantage of Earth's insulation. She discovered an abandoned prospect hole from some long-gone miner, 14 feet deep. She climbed down with a rope and spent 2 hours at the bottom experiencing the environment. The air was cool but not cold, perhaps 53 degrees. The walls were damp but not wet. Most importantly, the temperature was absolutely stable, while surface conditions varied 20 degrees between morning and afternoon. She emerged with complete understanding of what she needed to build. Not a root cellar, not a storage pit, but a proper chamber deep enough to reach stable temperature, large enough for living space, and integrated into her cabin for quick access. Elsa made her announcement in late May at a gathering of settlers at Tobias Went's cabin. 8 families had assembled to share news and trade goods. She waited for a natural pause, then spoke clearly. She intended to dig a chamber beneath her cabin floor, 8 feet deep, 8 feet in diameter, lined with stone. It would serve as emergency shelter with temperature maintained by the earth itself. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then Magnus Eriksson laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. A girl digging a grave beneath her own cabin and calling it survival. This was the most foolish thing he had heard in 15 years. Lars Bergman shook his head. The girl thought she knew better than experienced adults. Her father had kept her alive, but Henrik was gone now. A cabin was protection enough if you managed fire properly. Tobias Went looked at her with pity. He understood the principle, he said, but digging beneath an existing floor was dangerous work. The structure could collapse. Water would flood the chamber. Even if she built it sound, she would waste 3 months of labor for something she would never need. Ingrid Bergman urged her to come live with their family instead. 3 boys needed mending and cooking. She could earn her keep and learn proper skills. This digging foolishness would only lead to heartbreak. Elsa thanked them for their thoughts and said she would begin digging in the morning. The gathering dispersed with shaking heads and murmured predictions. Within a week, word had spread through the entire region. The Lindquist girl was digging a hole beneath her cabin. She called it a survival chamber. Everyone else called it a grave. They wagered on how long before she gave up or hurt herself or finally accepted what they all knew to be true, that a child could not survive alone in the mountains. Elsa began the excavation on the 1st of June, choosing a location in the northwest corner of the cabin, where the floor would be most easily cut and the structure least affected. She marked a circle 8 feet in diameter using charcoal tied to a string, scratching the outline into the packed dirt floor. The circle looked enormous, consuming nearly a quarter of the cabin's total space. She checked her measurements twice, then committed. The first day was deceptively encouraging. The top layer of soil was loose, disturbed years before when the cabin was built, and it came up easily. She dug down 18 inches and removed perhaps 30 buckets of dirt, hauling each one outside and dumping it in a pile behind the cabin. Her hands blistered despite years of calluses. Her back ached from constant bending. Her shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. But the progress was visible and encouraging, a hole in the floor that grew deeper with each hour. The second day introduced her to reality. At 20 inches down, the loose topsoil gave way to dense clay, heavy and sticky and resistant to every tool she possessed. The clay stuck to her shovel, adding weight. It clung to her boots in layers. It required real force to break apart. Her progress slowed to half the previous rate, then slower still as she descended into earth compressed by thousands of years. The third day brought rocks, not bedrock, but a layer of stones ranging from fist size to larger than her head, all embedded in clay like teeth in a gum. She switched from shovel to pickaxe, breaking apart clay to expose each stone, then prying them free. Some she could lift alone. Others required rigging a rope system, looping line around the stone and hauling it up hand over hand, her body weight barely sufficient to move rocks that weighed as much as she did. By the end of the first week, she had reached 4 feet of depth. The work was harder than anything she had ever experienced. Her entire body hurt in ways she had not known were possible. Her hands were raw despite cloth wrappings. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, her thin frame becoming gaunt as labor burned calories faster than she could replace them, and she was not even halfway to her target depth. Sigrid, the dog she had inherited from her father, watched from the edge of the pit with an expression Elsa interpreted as concern. The animal spent hours lying at the rim, occasionally whining when Elsa stayed down too long. At night, Sigrid curled up beside her, providing warmth and the simple reassurance of another heartbeat in the darkness. By the end of the 4th week, Elsa had reached 6 feet, and the work changed completely. The hole was now deep enough that she could no longer toss dirt out with her shovel. The walls rose above her head, enclosing her in an earthen tube that felt like the grave everyone said she was digging. She had to haul every bucket up using rope, filling it at the bottom, climbing the ladder she had built, pulling the bucket over the edge, dumping it, then descending to repeat. Each bucket took 5 minutes. Each foot of depth required approximately 50 buckets. At 7 feet, she hit water. Not a flood, but steady seepage that pooled at the bottom and turned clay into slippery mud. This was the problem Tobias had warned about. She stopped digging and spent 4 days solving drainage. She dug a sump pit in the center, 2 feet deeper than the main floor, and filled it with rocks of graduated sizes, creating a reservoir that collected water and let it seep into earth below. Around the perimeter, she dug a shallow channel, sloping toward the sump. The system worked. Water ran down to the channel, followed the slope, and disappeared into the rock fill. The floor stayed dry enough to continue. By mid-July, she reached 8 feet. The floor was level, roughly circular, approximately 8 feet across. Standing at the bottom and looking up, she could see the cabin floor far above. The temperature down here was noticeably different, cooler even on hot days, constant in a way the cabin could never be. She verified it by lowering a cup of water overnight. In the morning, it was cold as spring water. The earth was doing exactly what she had hoped, maintaining temperature independent of weather above, but the walls remained bare clay, temporary and vulnerable. She needed permanent stone walls, fitted with the same care that Tobias had used in his cellar, rock that would last for decades without maintenance or repair. Finding suitable stone took 3 weeks of searching and hauling. She needed flat pieces that would stack well, roughly rectangular in shape, large enough to provide strength, but small enough for a 14-year-old girl to carry. She found what she needed in a creek bed 3 miles from the cabin. Water-smoothed sandstone and limestone, broken from cliff faces upstream over centuries of floods. She hauled them back, using a travois built from pine poles and leather straps, making 3 trips each day, each trip requiring 2 hours of walking over rough terrain. By early August, she had accumulated enough to begin. The stonework was precise labor that required patience more than strength. She laid the first course directly on the chamber floor, setting each piece in clay mortar she mixed from excavated material. The stones needed to be level, requiring careful shimming and constant checking with a straight edge. A foundation that started crooked would only get worse as the wall rose. The second course overlapped the first in a running bond pattern, each stone spanning the joint between 2 stones beneath. This was basic masonry, knowledge absorbed from watching Tobias and studying her father's manual. Theory was easier than practice. Each stone had to be selected for fit, sometimes shaped by striking with a hammer, then set in mortar and checked for level before moving to the next. Visitors came in August and September, settlers who wanted to see the foolishness for themselves. Magnus Eriksson arrived first, watching Elsa fit stones with careful precision. He observed for 10 minutes without speaking, his expression shifting from amusement to something less certain. She had made more progress than he expected, he finally said. The walls were well constructed, but winter was coming. She would not finish in time. Elsa did not look up from her work. She would finish, she said simply. The walls would be complete by late September. Magnus shook his head and rode away. But his mockery had lost its edge. He had seen the work. He had seen what she had accomplished alone. By early September, the walls reached 5 feet high. The structure had taken visible shape. What had been a hole was becoming an underground room with solid walls that would last generations. She left gaps every few feet where stones did not quite meet, creating weep holes for moisture to drain through rather than building pressure behind a wall. By the end of September, the stone walls were complete. 8 feet of fitted stone rising from drainage sump to floor level, creating a circular room that would stand as long as anyone could imagine. The hatch she built was simple but strong, heavy timbers notched and pegged together, supporting a door of 3-inch pine planks. It weighed 70 pounds when complete, but lifted easily on leather hinges and sealed tight when closed. The latter was oak, built to last a lifetime, with rails mortised into the hatch frame at top and resting in carved depressions at bottom. The shelving system wrapped around half the chamber, split pine planks on oak brackets wedged into gaps in the stone walls. 4 levels of storage, 16 inches deep each. Enough space for supplies that would make this not just shelter, but functioning survival space. She stocked it methodically over following weeks. Preserved meat on the bottom shelf, smoked venison and dried fish, vegetables on the second shelf, potatoes and carrots traded from the Bergmans, blankets and spare clothing on the third shelf, sealed in oiled leather, tools and medical supplies on the top shelf, water jugs filled and sealed, candles for light, flint and steel for fire, A complete survival kit organized and ready for whatever emergency might require her to retreat below ground. She could survive down here for weeks if necessary, sustained by supplies she had gathered through months of careful preparation. On the 1st of November, Elsa descended into the completed chamber and closed the hatch above her. She sat on the stone floor with her back against the wall, and Sigrid pressed against her side, feeling the constant 52-degree temperature wrap around her. Above, through 2 inches of wood and 8 feet of earth, the first winter winds were beginning to blow. But down here, in the space everyone had called her grave, she was warm and safe. The testing would come soon. Winter would prove whether the settlers had been right to laugh, or whether a 14-year-old girl had seen something that experienced adults had missed all along. She sat in the darkness with her loyal dog and waited for what was coming, confident in her work, ready for whatever the mountains chose to throw at her this winter. The cold arrived in December with the force of a physical assault. The temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero on the night of December 10th and stayed there day after day, a sustained freeze that tested every structure and every person in the settlement. Elsa maintained her cabin fire during daylight hours, using it for cooking and daily tasks. But at night, she retreated to the chamber. The routine was simple and effective. She descended the ladder at dusk, closed the hatch, and spent 8 hours in the 52-degree warmth of the underground space. She woke at dawn, climbed back to the cabin, rebuilt the fire, and continued her work. The contrast with her previous winter was dramatic. Last year she had woken 4 times each night to tend fire, never sleeping deeply, always anxious about flames that stood between her and death. This year she slept soundly through the night, her body recovering fully, her mind clear and rested. Her firewood consumption dropped to 1/3 of what it would have been if she had tried to heat the cabin for sleeping. She had built not just a backup system, but something better than the conventional solution. November had brought an early cold snap that gave her the opportunity to test her concept before true winter arrived. She let the cabin fire die completely one evening, watching as flames diminished to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. The cabin temperature dropped rapidly. Within an hour she could see her breath. Within 2 hours, cold was seeping through her clothes. By full darkness, the cabin was perhaps 25 degrees inside, dangerous for extended exposure. Elsa gathered a blanket, a candle, and Sigrid, then descended into the chamber and closed the hatch. The temperature when she entered was 53 degrees. She wrapped herself in the blanket and sat on the floor with Sigrid curled beside her. Over the next 8 hours, the chamber temperature did not change. It remained absolutely stable, while the cabin above dropped well below freezing. The water bucket by the fireplace would have ice forming. Frost would be spreading across the window. But down here, the temperature held steady at 53 degrees, maintained by nothing but the thermal mass of surrounding earth. She could stay here indefinitely without risk of hypothermia. She was not warm exactly. 53 degrees was cool enough to be uncomfortable without insulation. But wrapped in blankets with her dog beside her, she maintained body temperature easily. The fire was optional now. The fire was backup rather than necessity. She had fundamentally changed the equation of frontier survival, shifting from dependence on flames to partnership with the earth itself. Word filtered through the settlement as December progressed, though Elsa did not know it. The Lindquist girl had survived the early cold snap. Her cabin showed smoke during days, but not at night. Visitors who passed close enough to observe noticed something strange. The smoke was thin and intermittent, nothing like the thick, constant plumes rising from cabins where settlers burned wood continuously just to stay alive. Some dismissed it as evidence that the girl was rationing unwisely, slowly freezing while trying to stretch supplies. Others were less certain. She had survived 6 weeks of killing cold, alone, with minimal fire. Either she was lucky beyond reason, or she had found something the rest of them had missed. The January blizzard would answer the question definitively. It arrived on the 17th, announced by the yellow-gray sky and shifting winds that experienced settlers recognized as harbingers of major weather. Elsa spent the afternoon making final preparations. Extra water hauled into both cabin and chamber, additional firewood stacked inside, emergency supplies checked and positioned. Then she ate a substantial dinner, fed Sigrid, and waited. The storm hit around 9 o'clock, a wall of wind and snow that made the cabin walls shudder. The noise was tremendous, wind screaming around corners, snow hissing against walls, branches cracking under ice load in the surrounding forest. Elsa built the cabin fire high, wanting to start with the space as warm as possible, then settled in. Through the long night, she tended fire and watched the temperature struggle. Despite continuous burning, the cabin barely reached 30 degrees. Cold found every gap in construction, every imperfect joint, every weakness that summer building had left. The wind created drafts that pulled heat away faster than fire could replace it. By morning, she had burned 3 days' worth of wood, and the storm showed no sign of weakening. The blizzard was only beginning, and it would continue for 7 days, testing everything and everyone in the settlement beyond what any of them had prepared for or imagined possible. The blizzard continued without pause for 7 days. The temperature outside reached 50 below zero on the 3rd night, cold so extreme that trees exploded from moisture in their trunks, freezing and expanding. Snow accumulated to depths of 6 feet in open areas, with drifts reaching the roof lines of cabins throughout the settlement. The wind maintained relentless assault, and visibility remained near zero for the entire duration. On the 2nd day, Elsa moved her essential activities underground. She kept minimal fire burning in the cabin, just enough to prevent the space from becoming completely unusable, but spent most of her time in the chamber. The contrast was remarkable. Above, the storm raged with killish fury, cabin walls groaning under wind loads, frost forming inches thick on interior surfaces, cold penetrating every defense. Below, the chamber remained absolutely stable at 53 degrees, quiet and dry, indifferent to the apocalypse occurring overhead. She developed a routine for the extended storm. Morning inspection of the cabin fire, adding enough wood to keep it alive. Brief forays to check snow loads and clear ventilation paths, then descent to the chamber for meals, rest, and preservation of her strength. On the 4th day, someone pounded on her cabin door. The sound was barely audible over the wind, but Sigrid heard it and barked. Elsa climbed from the chamber and crossed the frozen cabin to the door, lifting the bar and pulling it open against the wind's resistance. Magnus Eriksson stood in the doorway, coated in snow and ice, his face white with frostbite, barely able to stand. Behind him were Lars and Ingrid Bergman, visible through blowing snow. Their cabin had collapsed. Magnus gasped through frozen lips. Roof failed under snow load. They were freezing. They needed shelter. They could not make it to anyone else. Please. For a moment, Elsa simply looked at them. These were the people who had mocked her project, who had called her foolish, who had said she was digging her own grave. Magnus had laughed loudest of all. Now he stood at her door, begging to be let in, his life depending on the mercy of the girl he had dismissed. She stepped aside and let them enter. The cabin was barely warmer than outside, perhaps 25 degrees with minimal fire, but it was shelter from the wind. Magnus collapsed near the fireplace, while the Bergmans huddled together, all three shaking violently from cold exposure. They were in early stages of serious hypothermia. Elsa made a decision instantly. The cabin could not save them. Even with fire roaring at maximum, the space was too cold and drafty, but the chamber could maintain life indefinitely. She opened the hatch and helped them descend one at a time into the underground space. Magnus actually groaned with relief as he reached the bottom and felt the stable 53-degree air wrap around him. Ingrid began crying softly as she realized they had found genuine warmth. Lars simply stood in the center of the chamber, looking at stone walls and organized supplies, understanding slowly dawning on his face. Elsa descended last. Pulling the hatch closed behind her, she wrapped blankets around them and gave them warm water from her supplies, still drinkable thanks to above-freezing temperature. She built a small fire in the corner pit, not for heat, but to warm food and provide light. Then she sat back and watched them recover. Magnus was first to speak coherently. He looked at Elsa with an expression she had never seen from him, something beyond gratitude, closer to awe. "You built this," he said. "We laughed at you. We called it foolishness. And you built this." Elsa said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The chamber spoke for itself. On the 5th day, with storms still raging, there was more pounding at the door. The Wendt family, old Tobias and his grandson Eric, had arrived after a 5-mile journey through the blizzard. Their firewood had run out on the 3rd day. They had been slowly freezing despite burning furniture. Elsa brought them down to the chamber. On the 6th day, 2 more families arrived. The Nielsens, parents and 3 children, whose cabin had been buried so deeply they could not keep the chimney clear, and the Holmbergs, a young couple with an infant who had simply run out of options. 12 people now occupied the chamber designed for 1. The floor was covered with bodies. Supplies were being depleted rapidly, but the temperature remained 53 degrees, and every single person was alive when they should have been dead. The impossible chamber that everyone had mocked was now the only thing standing between 12 souls and the frozen death waiting above. The 4 of them remained in the chamber for the final 3 days of the storm, emerging only briefly to maintain the cabin fire and check conditions. The space was crowded with 12 people, but temperature remained stable, air remained breathable, and supplies proved adequate for extended occupation. The Bergmans and Magnus asked endless questions about the construction. How deep was the chamber? How had she prevented flooding? What kept the walls from collapsing? How did she maintain air quality? Elsa answered every question thoroughly, explaining principles from her father's mining manual, demonstrating drainage and ventilation systems, sharing knowledge she had accumulated through months of planning and work. The blizzard broke on the morning of January 24th, 7 days after it began. The wind died gradually through the night, and dawn arrived with clear skies and temperatures that had moderated to merely brutal, perhaps 15 below zero. Elsa climbed the ladder and pushed open the hatch to find her cabin buried under 4 feet of snow. Sunlight streamed through the window, the first natural light she had seen in a week, blindingly bright, reflecting off the white landscape. She cleared a path to the door and pushed it open, confronting a transformed world. Snow covered everything to depths she had never seen. Smooth white surfaces broken only by dark shapes of trees and occasional chimneys poking above the drifts. The settlement was silent. No smoke rising from cabins, no signs of movement, no indication of life. She did not know yet how many had died, how many cabins had collapsed, how many people had frozen while fires burned uselessly against the overwhelming cold. She would learn the full scope of disaster in coming days, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Everyone who had reached her chamber was alive. 12 people had survived 7 days of the worst blizzard in memory, warm and fed and safe, in a space that every adult in the settlement had said was impossible. The survivors emerged one by one, climbing the ladder and stepping into the frozen cabin, then out into the brilliant winter morning. They stood in deep snow and looked around at devastation, at collapsed roofs and buried cabins and absolute stillness that spoke of death. Then they looked at Elsa, 14 years old, thin and tired but alive, standing beside the hatch that led down to the space that had saved their lives. Magnus Eriksson was first to speak, his voice carrying across the silent settlement. She saved us all, and we laughed at her. The words hung in the frozen air, an acknowledgment and an apology all at once. The death toll from the storm was devastating when finally counted. 4 people had frozen in their cabins when fires failed. 2 more had died attempting to reach neighbors for help. The Anderson family, parents, and 4 children had vanished entirely. Their cabin collapsed and buried, bodies not recovered until spring thaw. In total, 12 people died in 7 days, nearly a quarter of the settlement's population. But 12 people had lived who should have died, and every one of them owed their survival to a 14-year-old girl and her underground chamber. The story spread rapidly through the surviving community and beyond. Traders carried it to Fort Union, where it was repeated with increasing detail. A girl had built an underground shelter that maintained warmth without fire. An entire settlement had survived in her cellar, while the worst storm in memory destroyed everything above. The impossible had become real, and the implications were being discussed by everyone who heard the tale. Visitors began arriving in February, settlers from distant homesteads who wanted to see the chamber for themselves. Elsa welcomed them all, descending with them, answering questions, explaining principles she had learned through study and experimentation. The temperature demonstration alone was convincing. Surface air at 10 degrees, chamber air at 53 degrees, no fire required, no fuel consumed. Magnus Eriksson asked to help her build another chamber beneath his own cabin. He provided all labor and materials, asking only for her guidance. They worked together through March and April, the man who had laughed loudest now following instructions from the girl he had dismissed. By the time spring arrived, 5 more settlers had begun excavation projects of their own. The technique that had been mocked as foolishness was spreading through the community. adopted by people who had seen its effectiveness proven in the most extreme conditions imaginable. Elsa helped anyone who asked, sharing her knowledge freely, teaching the principles of earth temperature, drainage, ventilation, and construction that made the chambers work. She never turned anyone away, never demanded payment, never reminded them that they had once called her foolish. Years passed, and the settlement grew as new families arrived, many of them specifically seeking the community that had pioneered underground shelter construction. By 1855, every cabin in the region had a chamber beneath its floor, and the technique had spread to settlements throughout Montana Territory. Deaths from fire failure during winter storms dropped to nearly zero in communities that adopted the approach. The improvement was so dramatic that territorial authorities began recommending underground chambers as standard construction practice for frontier homesteads. Elsa married in 1853 a carpenter named Thomas Garrett, who had come west specifically to learn her construction methods. They built a home together that incorporated every innovation she had developed, with chambers beneath the main cabin and connected tunnel systems that allowed movement between structures without surface exposure during storms. They had 4 children over the following decade, and each child learned the principles of underground construction as naturally as they learned to read and write. The chamber beneath her original cabin remained in use for 60 years. Successive owners maintained it carefully, understanding its value, and it served as emergency shelter during 3 more major blizzards in the decades following its construction. The stone walls Elsa had laid as a 14-year-old girl showed no sign of deterioration. The hatch and ladder were replaced twice as wood-aged, but the fundamental structure remained sound. In 1912, a historian researching frontier architecture documented the cabin and traced its origins back to Elsa Lindquist Garrett. The chamber beneath the floor was noted as the earliest known example of what had become standard practice throughout the Northern Territories, an innovation that had saved countless lives over half a century of frontier settlement. Elsa died in 1901 at the age of 68, surrounded by children and grandchildren in a home that remained warm through the coldest winters. Her obituary in the territorial newspaper described her as a pioneer of frontier construction, a woman who had changed how people survived in the mountains. The church was full for her funeral, packed with settlers and their descendants, many of whom would not have existed if not for the chamber she had built as a grieving orphan more than 50 years before. But the words that mattered most were spoken by her eldest grandson at the graveside. He stood before the assembled mourners, many of them gray-haired themselves now, and spoke simply. She was 14 years old and alone, he said. Her father had just died. Everyone told her she was wrong. They laughed at her idea. They called it a grave. They said a girl could not survive alone in the mountains. She built it anyway. She built it with her own hands, stone by stone, bucket by bucket, through an entire summer while grown men shook their heads and waited for her to fail. And when the worst blizzard in 50 years came, when those same men were burning their furniture and freezing in their proud cabins, they came to her door. They came begging to be let into the grave they had mocked, and she let them in, every single one. She saved 12 lives that week, including Magnus Eriksson, who had laughed loudest of all. And because she did, because she refused to listen to people who thought they knew better, we are all here today. The grandson paused, looking out at the crowd, at the families that existed because of one girl's stubborn refusal to accept conventional wisdom. The chamber was never just a hole in the ground, he continued. It was proof that a young person could see what experienced adults had missed. It was proof that innovation could come from anyone willing to question what everyone else accepted. It was proof that survival sometimes required building something new rather than repeating what had always failed. My grandmother taught me many things, but the most important was this. When everyone tells you something is impossible, that might be exactly the reason to try it. The mourners filed past her grave on the hillside, not far from where she had buried her own father 64 years before. The wind blew cold across the cemetery, carrying the first hints of the winter to come. But in the valley below, smoke rose from chimneys above cabins that each had a chamber beneath their floors, warmth waiting below if the fire should fail. The girl who had dug what everyone called her grave had instead dug salvation for generations to come. Her legacy lived on in every chamber, beneath every cabin, in every family that survived because she refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways, in every life saved by the simple truth that the earth holds warmth for anyone brave enough to seek it. And somewhere, in that space between memory and legend, Elsa Lindquist still sits at the edge of her hatch with her faithful dog beside her, watching the frost spread across the window glass, waiting calmly while the blizzard rages outside, knowing that the earth below will always keep her warm, just as she always knew it would, just as she proved to everyone who doubted her.